The National Association of Counsel for Children advances children's and parents' rights by supporting a diverse, inclusive community of child welfare lawyers to provide zealous legal representation, and by advocating for equitable anti-racist solutions co-designed by people with lived experience. Learn more at naccchildlaw.org, counselforkids.org, and at our National Child Welfare Law Conference in Cleveland this August.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on social media. All right, so we are recording under a bit of duress this week. Nothing too challenging, but I'm in Cleveland for the conference held every year by the National Association of Counsel for Children, and we're gracious enough to give us an exhibitor booth in the halls. So I've been manning that and meeting people, popping into some of their panels. Ran into Angela Orkin, who is one of the co-hosts of the Children's Law Podcast, which is a proud member of Safe Camp Audio. So it's great to see her. I also just talked for an hour with Lacy, who is one of the cooler people I've met in the child welfare circles to date. She is down in Louisiana. I'll post a link to our podcast interview from a couple years ago. Really, really innovative approach. She is working with young people who have experienced foster care to get them in braces, get them feeling better about their dental health, and using that as kind of an entry point to work with them on mental health as well. So it's very good to see her. Very cool to be here. That said, I am in a hotel room with an AC unit that I can't seem to turn off, so there's going to be a hum behind me. And I also have no microphone with me, so I apologize for that as well. But we'll get through it. We don't have a guest today. We're going to do some headlines, and I'm going to keep it pretty brief since we are a little delayed anyway in producing this, but we truck through. So like I said, it's a headlines edition. Let's start in Washington, D.C. and what's going on with the Trump administration and Congress. And within that, we'll start with some movement and leadership at the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, within HHS, the Administration for Children and Families is sort of the main organization or agency within there that oversees both family support, welfare supports, everything from low-income heating to temporary assistance for needy families, and then also all of child welfare, right? Preventing foster care services, adoption, that all falls within ACF. And the nominee to serve as the head of the Administration for Children and Families had his Senate confirmation hearing at the Senate Finance Committee, which is the part of Congress that, on the Senate side at least, has the jurisdiction over most child welfare stuff. So that hearing was held in July. He did get an affirmative vote from the Senate committee. And so barring any really truly unforeseen circumstance, I certainly expect that Alex Adams will be confirmed shortly to lead the Administration for Children and Families, which heretofore in the second Trump administration has been led by Andrew Grattison. And it'll be interesting to see where he goes next. He is a child welfare policy expert who was working in Congress before this. My understanding is he's graduating law school during the summer. So interesting to see where he slots in. My guess is that he won't leave the administration, but maybe fill another role. But we'll see. What do I know? Anyway, so the hearing was, I wouldn't call it contentious. We did have kind of an interesting contentious hearing last time around in the Trump administration. Lynn Johnson was Trump's nominee to lead ACF in the first administration. And during that hearing, this was at a time when the Trump administration has frozen in place some proposed changes in how we would go about collecting federal data and state data around foster care and adoption through the AFCAR system. And Senator Wyden, who's the lead Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee and still is, basically just said he was a no vote and was not going to support Ms. Johnson until something, happened with that, and that the Trump administration showed, some path to, new data being collected and all that stuff. We're still kind of dealing with some of the fallout from that now, actually. Anyway, I wouldn't say there was like a huge point of contention as specific as that this time. Adams did say that he, envisions child welfare as a focal point for him in the course of his time with the administration, assuming that he gets that time. Quoting directly from him during the hearing, "If past this prologue, where I intend to spend disproportionate time and my energy and a disproportionate amount of my effort is improving child welfare, specifically the foster care and adoption systems." And he also mentioned that prevention of foster care would be a focal point for him as well. I should have probably mentioned before this, we did talk about Alex Adams on a previous podcast. Mr. Adams served in Idaho's government for quite a while, the latter part of it running basically child welfare and other human services under Brad Little, the governor. And before he took that role, he was prominently involved under the Little administration in developing something that, a lot of conservative circles has kind of been embraced as a best practice, which is zero-based regulation, which is kind of a conceptual way of ensuring that regulations are approached with the idea that they will sunset unless you prove the need to continue them, as opposed to, becoming law and somebody needing to proactively end them. There's much more to it than that, and I'll drop a link for people that want to read more about zero-based regulation in their spare time outside of listening to this podcast. But that's kind of like the basic gist of it. Maybe we'll get then Assistant Secretary Adams, when he is confirmed on this podcast, to talk about it more intellectually than I just did. I do expect that is part of what his, orders will be, is to take his expertise in regulation and apply it, not just to child welfare, but to all things at ACF. So that's going to be a pretty interesting thing to cover. Senator Wyden, again, the lead Democrat on Senate Finance, did voice some concern over Adams and the administration that he's poised to join. I'm just going to quote from Senator Wyden from the hearing. "My team was told by advocates on the ground in Idaho and across the country that they are terrified of what he," and I mean, in he, I'm adding parenthetically, Adams, "has done in his state, harming vulnerable children, families, and people with disabilities, and the actions he will be poised to take nationwide should he be confirmed. Dr. Adams is a proponent of deregulation at any cost, what he and other conservative elites call zero-based regulation," end quote. So sounds like a no vote, but he did move through, and I do expect that he will, in fact, be confirmed to lead that office. In the meantime, the Administration for Children and Families has put out the sort of public bat signal through the Federal Register, looking for some input from the public on a few things, including how to help states better implement the Indian Child Welfare Act and how to improve the clearinghouse around the Family First Prevention Services Act, specifically around prevention services. I do think it's a kind of noteworthy statement in the notice from the Trump administration. They said this, and I'm quoting, "ACF believes that states and tribes working together to ensure that the protections of ICWA are afforded to Indian children is paramount." So that's got to be music to the ears of folks who are wondering whether, internally the Trump administration and their child welfare team, intended to put the Indian Child Welfare Act and tribal children and families kind of in the forefront of what they were doing. So Alex Adams is moving along, and we, like I said, expect that he will be confirmed to lead the Administration for Children and Families. Meanwhile, still no movement on leadership for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which is an agency within the Department of Justice that, not exactly apples to apples, but is essentially the ACF of juvenile justice. So that job actually does not require Senate confirmation. It used to. So Trump can just basically say who he wants, and they can start the next day. That hasn't happened yet. And even really the position above the leader for the Office of Juvenile Justice, who would lead the bigger place called Office of Justice Programs, there hasn't been a nominee for that yet either. Trump had put somebody in pretty quickly at OJJDP last time around during his first administration. Her name is Karen Harp. Biden also moved pretty quickly to put Liz Ryan in, but still no news yet on this second go around for Trump there. And I think it is safe to say at this point there's rising concern about what the administration has planned for juvenile justice in that whole corner of the world because of the actions taken earlier this year with money that went out in 2025. And then also more recently, the inaction about money that hasn't gone out in 2025. So follow me here. There's kind of two stories, and we have written about both. So I'll drop some links for people that want to read further. But, early in the Trump administration post-inauguration, hundreds of Justice Department grants were canceled, including several $100 million of grants to support various youth justice and child welfare endeavors, some by state and local government, more by nonprofits and colleges. And some of those grantees successfully appealed. We asked OJJDP earlier in the year for a list of the grantees that had successfully, appealed those terminations and got it. We didn't hear back, or they were not going to provide us with that. I did hear recently that the court-appointed special advocates program, which gets more than $10 million usually a year from the Department of Justice through OJJDP, did get restored, but I don't know much about who else has been successful. But those were actually grants from previous fiscal years, not the one that we're in, which is 2025. Perhaps equally as big a story, which is developing now, is that on any given year, a few $100 million goes out the door from OJJDP for juvenile justice grants, for other things. And the way that happens, is not unlike most other discretionary grant making from the federal government. There's a solicitation that goes out, it's published, everybody can see what the rules and eligibility and ideas are behind the grants that are being offered. Hopeful entities apply. There's a review process that's going to involve staff at the agency. It's going to involve lawyers and counsel. It's going to have a peer review usually. And then usually towards the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th, the awards are announced. Some of the things that are typically funded in this way from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention are what's called Title II formula grants. This is the money that states get in exchange for adhering to the federal standards around juvenile justice, which largely are rooted in sort of not locking up status offenders or kids that are, truant or whatever, and how you treat kids when you do have them in adult settings, in an incarceration setting, even whether it's jail or whatever. So those Title II grants are put out that way. Mentoring grants that go out to, after school programs and mentoring agencies, services for missing and exploited youth, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we are here's basically what the story is. We're about halfway through August. And as of the time I'm recording this, there are exactly 0 notices of funding available that have been put out from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So another way to look at that is, if they are planning to give LA millions and millions of dollars in grants this year, they have not told anybody publicly or put up a notice about any of it yet. And like I said, we're midway through August. The process really has to be completed by September 30th. And you're talking about a process that generally takes, the better part of half a year. Let's put it that way. I think there's, reasonably 30 to 60 days of notice from the time that a notice is put up until somebody puts in their application. And then there's probably just that much time that goes into kind of peer review and judging these things. So we're talking about something that usually takes a couple of months, and they may have, 1 calendar month of business days to get this done. And the big question, I guess, that some are wondering is this intentional, and is the Trump administration just simply not going to compete out and then distribute grants that have been funded and appropriated by Congress? I think a second order question that people are trying to figure out is, if there is some rushed process, or if they do not finish by the end of the fiscal year, what happens then? I've heard from, some legal experts who say that, that money then theoretically goes back to the Treasury unless Congress steps in and does something. I've heard that if a grant is written in such a way where it envisions kind of like 3-year horizons for the grant, then they really technically have that 3-year period to make the grants happen. But this is kind of new territory. I don't think this has come up very often, where the process has just lagged this far behind. So we will see by the next time we do a headlines edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. We'll be much closer to this deadline, and we'll see whether a bunch of solicitations have gone up and sort of what the timeline and envisioned path of that is. We did talk about this with Darla Bardine of the National Network for Youth in a recent podcast interview that I'll drop a link for people that missed that. But this was happening as well with the runaway and homeless youth money on the Health and Human Services side. And really right around the time that we published that interview, a solicitation, a public notice went up for that money. My understanding, I just kind of caught up with Darla about this, is that most grantees that wanted to apply, even though it was a very tight timeline, did get their applications in. Maybe not all of them applied for every single opportunity that they could have with more time. But, that stuff got done. But still, the ball is now back to, in that case, HHS to actually take those applications and in, basically 60 days time, decide who's going to be the winners. So it's all on a pretty rushed timeline with a lot of nervous eyes on it. Let's put it that way. Just to close out and going back to the Justice Department for a minute, I did get some comment from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention on this, because I just kind of put it to them like, are you guys intending to put money out into the field this year, fiscal 2025? The answer that came back, and I'm quoting from them here, is the Office of Justice Programs FY 2025 notices of funding opportunities are being posted on a rolling basis as they are finalized. Notices are available at grants funding / Office of Justice Programs. So I would read that to mean that their intention is to roll out every expected grant. I followed up to clarify with them whether that was the plan or not and didn't hear back. So there's just really no telling. And when they say that it's on a rolling basis as they're finalized, there are some grants. Notice that when I read that the statement came from the Office of Justice Programs, which is much bigger than just the juvenile justice stuff. Indeed, there are a bunch of notices that are up, but then none of them are from the Office of Juvenile Justice. So we're just still in wait and see mode with that. Last little round out on federal action, and I'm going to have a guest on soon to break this stuff down much better than I'm about to. But there's, as one might predict, a lot going on in the space between child welfare services and youth who are either undocumented in the United States or are here in search of asylum protection. So just to kind of tick off a few of the things and developments that have gone on recently. So in 2022, the Biden administration established a policy around youth who received Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, SIJS, which is a designation that was created by Congress back in 1990 as a path to citizenship for immigrant kids who had experienced abuse and neglect and couldn't be, returned to their family in another place. And, this Biden administration action, which I think was just kind of loosely called deferred action, allowed kids with this status to work in the United States and be protected from deportation while that process was moving forward and they were getting a visa. On June 6th, the Trump administration released a new policy alert that stated that juvenile court findings about an undocumented child who had been abused or neglected are not, quote, sufficiently compelling, end quote, reasons to afford protection from deportation or permission to work. So that basically unwound the Biden policy. There has been a lawsuit filed to challenge that action. And I just feel like I say this 100 times every episode, but that's because we do so much good work. I'll post our story on this in the show notes, and we will continue to cover that. Second one I wanted to call out was the Department of Health and Human Services announced this summer that it would expand the list of federal funding streams that exclude most undocumented immigrants, including several programs related to child welfare. And those programs include Title 4E prevention, right? That is the kind of new addition to the 4E entitlement that was added during the Family First Prevention Services Act. Education training vouchers, which is part of the CHAFE program and gives something like $43 million out every year to states to help youth who are in foster care or who have been in foster care afford college or post-secondary learning. Kinship guardianship programs, which were part of the Fostering Connections Act. It's 4E money to help pay for guardianship placements in instances where usually relatives are willing to step up and be the permanent option for a kid, but maybe don't want to, adopt or have that kind of legal status in there. So what they did here was essentially announce that, to make it clear that these funding streams, you could not use these dollars for most undocumented immigrants. And just quoting from HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy, for too long, the government has diverted hardworking Americans' tax dollars to incentivize illegal immigration. That was his statement about the motives behind the plan. So this policy decision rescinds basically a very old interpretation of a 1996 law called the Personal Responsibility in Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. I know that's a lot of words. Basically, you could just think of it as welfare reform because that's what it was. And that was a bipartisan bill during the Clinton administration that, essentially rewrote child welfare policy on the federal level. This policy that it rescinds is it was basically like passed or kind of like put into motion 2 years after that welfare reform bill was passed. And that interpretation established a long list of federal public benefits that only quote unquote qualified aliens could be connected to. So it was a long list. The Trump administration's view is that it was not long enough, so they are going to add things. And kind of looking at looking at what they added specifically, it's kind of like catch-up policy here. They're taking mostly programs like 4E prevention or kinship guardianship that were just not in existence at the time that, the original interpretation around qualified aliens was in place, and just making clear that, our view and now policy is that they are included in this. And then the last immigration-related story I wanted to call out, and I'll drop a link to something that Priscilla Alvarez wrote on CNN.com about this. The Trump administration has moved to more quickly deport some children arriving at the border without a parent or guardian, generally referred to as unaccompanied minors or unaccompanied alien children, by having federal agents who apprehend them, particularly when they are teenagers, whether they want to voluntarily depart the country immediately. This is a directive which comes as the administration kind of seeks generally to ramp up deportations. And it is a departure from the protocol around kids who are arriving from countries that are basically anywhere but Mexico and Canada. So, the basic way to explain this is there's really only one national foster care system in the United States, and that is the one that takes in kids who arrive from not Mexico or Canada in search of asylum or protection of some kind. Generally, what happens there is they're apprehended by Border Patrol. They're handed over to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services, who finds some shelter or foster home for them to live in while they seek a sponsor who is like a relative or somebody close to the kid in the country. And so what has happened here, there was kind of a hilarious comment in the CNN story from a spokesperson who said, the only change pursuant to the Big Beautiful Bill is expanding this option to return home to unaccompanied alien children from additional countries beyond Mexico and Canada. And that's funny because they're saying only change as if that's not a substantial one. That is something that affects, thousands and thousands of kids, although we are at a kind of historic low of kids even coming to the border unaccompanied to seek asylum at this point. But anyway, back to this program. Basically the policy was that if you apprehended a youth and they reported that they were seeking asylum, there was not this back and forth with Border Patrol. There was just a move of custody over to the Department of Health and Human Services. So what's happening here is they are giving permission. It's based on this quote. It's from permission given in the Big Beautiful Bill to have a repartee with the child at the border to see if they would like to go home. And I think that, that's a fairly general description, and it would be interesting to see what exactly those conversations look like, whether it's somebody with Border Patrol just specifically only asking that, hey, would you rather, instead of going through this process, go back to the country of origin for you and your family, or would you like to continue? I mean, that's very different than if that conversation is a 30-minute one in which they are outlining, potentially horrendous things that might happen if they continue to seek asylum in the United States or something like that. So I think there's rightfully probably a lot of concern around what exactly those conversations look like. It will be interesting to see how often children take them up on that. I could see some of them who were sent to that border alone wanting to turn around and come back after what, for a lot of kids is a pretty arduous journey. Okay, so that's the federal stuff for today. I'll round out here quickly with just a few recommendations of some recent Imprint news stuff from our reporters. And I'm going to start with Sarah Tiano's recent piece on California's decision to halt the use of adoption assistance money to pay for out-of-state residential care for kids who are adopted from foster care in the state, which, to be clear, doesn't mean if you adopt a child in foster care in California and you wish with your own money to send them to residential care anywhere else in the country or the world for that matter, that is up to you. But California is taking itself out of the business of using state and federal money to help pay for those arrangements. So this follows several years after Tiano and some reporters from the San Francisco Chronicle teamed up to do an investigation that sort of exposed the practice of California counties foster youth and kids who were involved in the juvenile justice system out of state to some questionable providers who had a fairly spotty track record on safety. At that time, the California rules and regulations around congregate care facilities were being tightened to make sure that those places were run correctly in California. And that out-of-state option for counties was really sort of like an aberration of that. They didn't need to live up to, or nobody was really making sure that those facilities adhered to the standards that the California programs had. And so now this is essentially, in a way, just an extension of that to cover at least the public dollars supporting adoptive parents and the kids from foster care that they have adopted. And I'll drop a link to that story in the show notes. Second one I wanted to call out was a kind of interesting story from Nancy Marie Spears, our Indigenous Children and Families reporter, about a recent effort to survey current and former Indigenous foster youth by the Center for Native American Youth, who wanted to know about their experience and their views on the system. About 50 young people have participated so far. And one of the early themes raised up by the surveyors is this demand for cultural connection that really rose up. And Nancy quotes one of the young person's responses here, quote, "Cultural identity, connection to tribe and language, and being understood in our traditions are just as important as safety. Many of us feel isolated or erased in non-native foster placements. Adults need to listen to our stories and protect our connections and not break them." Third story I wanted to call out is from our new Georgia reporter, Jordan Anderson, on a troubling trend that may impact the state's foster care system, and not in a good way. Despite an overall decline in homelessness in Atlanta, which is by far the largest metropolis in the state, the number of homeless families increased between 2023 and 2024. So you had homelessness overall down, but the number of homeless families increasing between 2023 and 2024. Now, only two of the families that were identified in this process were actually on the street homeless, as opposed to in a shelter together or in a transitional program. And we're not talking about like an enormous whole number, right? Anderson's reporting is that it's, typically between 130, 150 homeless families that are in Atlanta at any given time. So, the increase, it's gone up by about 15 families, but this is a much more difficult group for a shelter or housing program to keep supported and safe than single adult, or really in some ways, even kids who are on their own. Keeping a family intact and supporting them is a much tougher capacity issue, right? So, drivers behind this, I don't think it's a coincidence. Rent has increased 40% in Atlanta in the past 5 years. A recent report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that a minimum wage worker in Georgia who earned $7.25 an hour would need to work 163 hours per week or 4 full-time jobs to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And finally, just wanted to note the passing of 2 pretty influential folks on the child welfare side of things from what we cover. Paul Vincent and Carl Dennis both passed away over the summer. Paul Vincent served as Alabama's child welfare director during and after a class action lawsuit brought over the system's treatment of children with serious mental health needs, the reduction of foster care, and the improvements in services for youth in the system that were made under Paul Vincent and then after him by his successor, Jerry Milner, who we've had on this podcast before. He led child welfare policy, in the first Trump administration. Really, their strategy around, changes in that system in Alabama made it one of kind of the more heralded class action strategies of all time. And then Carl Dennis was basically the godfather of wraparound services. He was hired to be the executive director of a program in Chicago called Kaleidoscope back in the 70s. He began to develop an approach that was built around unconditional care, meaning no kid or their family was rejected from participating, and there were not ejections for bad behavior. That is a ethos that has permeated lots of organizations since. Youth advocate programs comes to mind for me, somebody that embraces that. And that unconditional care became a kind of central tenet to the wraparound approach, which you'll see in sort of clearinghouses of like approved models. I would say that it's an approach more than a model. It's not a specific treatment as much as it is a way of, committing to wrapping around a child and their family in a way that is unconditional in its care and involves them in the decision making. So rest in peace to both of those guys. I'll drop a link to the kind of short obituaries that we published in the Imprint about both of them. That's going to do it for this edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Sorry if the sound quality is less than stellar this time, although I'm sure my wizard of a producer, Christine Anjoko, will whip it into passable shape. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the SafeCamp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.